Hi, my name is Carol. I'm going to take a little time here to show you how to recover an RV Valance. I was looking online when I was getting ready to do this, and I didn't see that anybody had anything written up about how these things are assembled, so I thought I'd spend a little time showing you how I did it for mine. This is the one that has the typical day-night shade that seems to come with a lot of RVs these days. And first thing you have to do is remove the day-night shade, and that involves taking out these buttons down here. These are the tensioning buttons. They have a screw in the middle with a Phillips head screw. And then for this one, up underneath, there are two screws, one on either side, that go into the board that's at the top of this valance up here, behind here. And so you have to take those two screws out and the two screws out at the bottom. You remove the valance then and put that aside. They recommend that you wrap a rubber band about it because they tend to spring out. And then on this valance itself, we have down here, there's a screw that's holding it into the wall, and this one has going straight up into the back. There are two screws that go right into the cabinet that's up here. There's one screw here and one screw here. So you have to remove those, and when you do that, the valance comes right down. Now, when they built our RV, they actually made a mistake, and as we tried to pull this valance off, it wasn't coming free, and we found out that they had stuck an additional screw down here in the corner going up, because apparently the screw that they took in through the back didn't go into anything, so they needed to add another screw here. So if you're trying to pull this thing off and you find out it's not coming off of the wall, take a look around to see if there's some other screw that's holding your valance in place. Going to be, for this little demonstration, covering the much larger valance that we have over our dinette window here. You can see that I've already removed it, and I have it lying down here on the bed at this point. Now you can see what the structure of a typical valance looks like at this point. This is the back. There's no fabric placed on the back here. These are the vertical pieces, and this is the decorative crossbeam that goes on the top. Now, in the way the structure of these valances seem to be built is they have a typical 1-inch board that goes all across the top. This is the one that bolts up into the cabinet. Then on the side here we have, and it's hard to see here, I'll be looking at it more later, you have a 1/4-inch board. This is the one that bolts to the wall. Then going down here, they have another 1-inch board on the side, and then they have another 1/4-inch cover that comes back here. And one of the things that we found out as we started taking it apart, this thing is stapled and nailed together all over the place. So you spend a lot of time taking nails out and staples out in order to get this thing taken apart. The small valance on the other side took me 2 days. It took me basically about 4 or 5 hours to actually get all of the staples removed and get all the pieces taken apart before I was able to actually then cut the new cover and staple it back together. Now, for this valance, one of the first things that has to happen is this decorative trim that runs across the top, and you can see that would be this trim here. That needs to come off first. And what that involves is there's staples here where it was pulled, the fabric was pulled to the back and stapled in place. And then what we found out is there's nails. They look like they are about 1-inch brads that go right through the fabric. So what I have to do is I have to take a screwdriver and pry this thing out. On the other one there was one brad here, and then there were a whole bunch on the other side, coming from the other side, going all the way along this board here, and do the same thing on the other side. And then once you have that pried loose, then you can begin to take the fabric off. So I'll get started on doing that. Alright, to take apart this valance, you're not going to need a lot of tools, I found that I ended up needing a variety of flat-bladed screwdrivers. Usually the wider the blade, the better. Plus you're going to need a real small one that's as thin as possible at the top, because you're going to be using this to wedge underneath all of those staples to get out. And then you're going to need some needle nose pliers, different sizes, just to be able to yank on those staples and get them removed from the fabric and from the wood. Alright, at this point I have removed that first grouping of staples that were holding this piece of fabric down, and as I mentioned, this side of this trim is held on by what looks like a 1-inch brad. So in order to remove that, I'm going to have to put a fairly wide, large screwdriver down in here and just pry it open. And you can see the nails sticking out here. I'll later on either use the larger needle nose plier to remove that, or I'll go through with a hammer, pry these things out. But all of these have to be removed. Be careful, it's not a problem if the brad pokes through, comes through the wood, because you're just going to be recovering it anyway, but just be careful not to crack your wood, or you'll be going to the hardware store to buy some new ones. Alright, at this point I have released the sides of this additional decorative trim, both sides over here. And now what I need to do is use the same technique with the large flat screwdriver, place it down in this line here, and wedge this piece of trim out. There are 1-inch brads all along here, and so I have to be careful because we don't want to. I don't want to break this. I want to maintain this kind of trim. Now, of course, if you're thinking that you want to do something different, if you don't have this trim, you won't have to do that. Or if you're planning on getting rid of this trim, if you do have it and doing something completely different, then go ahead and break it. But I want to keep it, so I'm going to be very careful when I peel this out. And one of the differences, my main differences, this one has nails that go all the way down on this side, plus they have nails right here that go into that 1-inch piece of wood on the other side. So it's the same process of pulling the nails out and prying this thing off, but I have to pry it both from these vertical beams here and this top horizontal beam. I want to show you all of the nails. I mentioned that the side, the decorative trim on the top, is nailed all on the side of the vertical piece, and here are all of the nails that were in there, quite a few. They don't want this thing to fall apart when they put it together, and including some nails along the top. And so that's why you have to be really careful when prying this apart, because if you want to keep your wood, you got to be real careful prying it or you'll crack it. And again, I still have additional nails along the front, so I have to continue to be careful. But you can see here that this is the vertical piece. It is not nailed through. So once I get rid of all of these nails along the front here, this piece will come loose at that point. And then I still have a little bit more to take apart, but that's most of it. Alright, you can see I've now got the valance into its 4 principal pieces taken apart now. I haven't yet removed the nails. There's some more of the nails there. And now what I'm going to have to do is start taking out all these staples from every single one of these. It is also possible that if you decide that you want a different shape, like here I've got these real tight corners, if you don't like the shape of your valance, this would be the time you just take this, use it for the basic width dimensions and maybe the depth dimensions, and go and buy another piece of, this is a 1/4-inch wood here, you buy another piece of 1/4-inch wood and you cut it to the shape you want, and then you add the foam in here to add some padding, and you can actually at this point completely redesign your valance. You might as well keep these side pieces. Those are pretty typical that you have, and so you can save a little money just by replacing this piece here if you don't like the shape. I'm going to keep it because I'm not unhappy with it. I think it's perfectly fine. You can see the cross section of the vertical pieces here, and I'll be working on this later, but this is this vertical piece here, this is the part that attaches to the wall, bolts to the wall, and this is the part that comes out in front. You can see where the decorative piece was nailed onto it, and it's 3 pieces of wood. This one has to be separated from these ones, because this piece of fabric wraps all the way around and goes underneath, so that you have a nice finish edge here on the inside, because you can see this area here. So this piece also has to be peeled off and removed. So eventually we're going to end up with 2, 4, 5, 6, 7 separate pieces that make up this valance, all of which have to be then recovered individually. Before I take off the fabric on the decorative cross piece that goes across the top, I wanted to point out that when you take all the staples out and you finally unwrap this thing, it is a single piece of cloth that wraps all the way around. This is not multiple pieces. Now make sure that you save the fabric, because you'll be using the fabric later on as your pattern for cutting the new fabric to go over the top of this, and you need to do that. Another thing we found out when we finally took this thing apart, which is kind of amusing, they don't use actual hinges, at least not in mine. They actually use duct tape to put this thing together, and that creates a hinge right here. They had to put a little bit of space in between the 2 boards so that it could fold nicely. I don't know if they do that because it's cheaper to use duct tape, or if they wanted it to be light, but it seems to be pretty effective. Once it's all nailed together and put together, it holds together just fine. I want to point out a couple things on the vertical piece of the valance before I finish taking it apart. You can see here I've removed the staples. This is the outside of the vertical piece. That would be here on this valance. That's this side right here on the outside. You can see why it's wrapped around and it goes behind. This is the part that's against the wall. And when I take that apart, you can see here, this is the part that lies against the wall. It's wrapped around. So I had staples all along here, and now I got more staples along here that have to be taken out. And then these 2 pieces have to be separated. Now you have on the bottom, make sure you keep track of how the fold works on the bottom, because this back piece wraps around and it folds under and it gets stapled, and then this this piece that's coming from the inside gets stapled on the bottom right there. And another thing that happens on this is all along this inside edge there are staples in there as well. Now you can't see those because this is facing outward like this. So you will have staples that you'll be putting on here. I haven't removed them as yet, in order to make this nice and flush. When you take all the fabric off, take all the pieces off, make sure you keep them together so that you're not losing track of what piece goes with what. You might want to either mark it or just somehow attach them, or make sure that you line everything up so that whatever fabric comes off of whatever piece is together, so that when you cut it, you have a right pattern, right piece going with the right piece of wood. Alright, now we add more staples on top of more staples. This was the piece that was lying against the wall. I finally got it removed, removing all those 1-inch long staples that were along the front. You pull that aside, and now you see where this is the final side piece, and even still there are more staples going into the 1-inch side wall. So all these have to be removed, and then the staples that were down here have to be removed. When that's done, I finally got the thing uncovered, and I'll be ready to start cutting the new pieces. Alright, so now I have all the fabric off, and I have all the pieces taken apart that need to be taken apart. The only piece that doesn't is this one right here, since the fabric's going to wrap all the way around it. This is the piece that goes against the wall. I would recommend adding some sort of a mark. I put an X here. That's the side that gets fabric put on it when it wraps around, because this side doesn't. Just so to keep track later on when you're, after you cut the pieces out, to make sure that you get the fabric on the right side. Alright, I'm going to start cutting my fabric. I want to talk a little bit about the fabric itself. I'm actually using an ultra leather for some of the trim, but I would recommend a fabric that's supple, that's easy to fold, easy to bend. If you get something that's too stiff, you might find it's difficult to get it to curl around the corners and the edges. For my decorative fabric, I'll be using this material right here. One of the problems I do have with this particular fabric, it tends to fray fairly easily, so this one's not an easy fabric to work with. And you'll notice here it has a pretty rough selvage with quite a distance on it here. Alright, I've got my first piece pinned on, ready to be cut. This is the piece that goes against the wall. A couple things to know here is I've got the back of the new fabric face up, and I've got the back of the old fabric face up. You don't want to do pin them back to back or front to front, because you might accidentally wind up with a mirror image of what you're trying to achieve. And when you cut this, don't skimp on the edges. Add a little bit extra length. This doesn't have to be perfectly accurate, because you're just folding it over and it won't be seen anyway. You might want to add a little bit extra on the top. Anything that winds up being extra later on, you can trim it off. But it's better to be a little bit generous on all the fold over edges to start with. I'm now in the process of cutting the long strip. This is the trim that goes along the top of my valance. And this valance is, the total length of this trim is over 60 inches. And as a result, most fabric that you use for upholstery is usually 54 inches wide. So I have to actually lay this fabric out lengthwise. So if you were working with a pattern, which I'm not here, fortunately, you might have a little bit of difficulty if the pattern has a tendency to have it up lengthwise along the fabric if you have a really long window. So that's something to keep in mind when you're actually creating a valance and recovering a valance. Fortunately, all the fabric I picked does not have a noticeable up direction, so that's not a problem for me. Now I'm ready to cut the one piece of pattern fabric that I have for my new valance cover. And one of the things to note when I pinned this down is I measured the distance from this. You can barely see it, but this is where the fold was around the edge of the piece of wood on the old fabric. And so I measured the distance to the selvage and make sure that was reasonably even all the way along, because when I put this on, especially if you have something like a plaid or a stripe, you want to make sure that you're getting the plaiding or the striping correctly lined up with the edges of the valance. Otherwise it might look a little crooked. And in addition, as I mentioned, I have a very wide selvage here, and this fabric does tend to come apart quite readily. So I have backed off a fair distance from the selvage, which really does fray a lot. And just to make sure that I am not bordering up on an area here where the fabric is a little bit looser than it is towards the center, I will again make sure that I have generous fabric all around the edge here, a little bit extra just so I have more room to cut, especially when it comes to those corners, because that's the most difficult aspect to work with this particular fabric. So I'm ready to cut this one last piece, and after that we start stapling. Alright, now I'm ready to start stapling these fabric back onto my wood. And to reassemble this whole thing, the tools you're going to need is a staple gun. Some people use an electric one, I don't have one. You're going to need staples, and you'll notice that the depth of the staples, these are 1/4 inch deep. You don't want to go any deeper because this wood is not very thick. I use wire brads instead of those long staples, because the staple gun I have doesn't handle long staples, so the wire brads seem to work pretty good. And then of course a hammer. One thing I ought to mention here is, as you're putting the fabric together, if you have a pattern, This is the side pieces, the two side pieces on one side. If you have a pattern, you want to make sure that the pattern of your piece against the wall matches, is lined up with the pattern that goes on the piece that's on the side. Otherwise you'd have a disconnect and it would look a little strange. I don't have a pattern on my material, so I don't have to worry about it. Well, basically you're just going to be folding over and stapling away. So it's fairly straightforward from this point on. I've started the process of stapling. This is the edge that goes against the wall here. And you can pull it pretty snug as you go along, and make sure you put plenty of staples in. I don't know if you need to have quite as many as they put in originally. And right here we have the hole that the bolt goes into that puts it directly into the wall. My fabric, I can actually feel where that hole is, so I don't need to mark it. If you have a fabric that you can't feel through, you will probably want to do something to mark it before you get all the fabric wrapped around. You'll be wrapping around on the edge and just making kind of a nice little edge and pulling it real tight when you do that. You'll have a little creasing in the corner, but that's the way it was originally. There's no way to avoid it, but if you do it nice and tight, it'll actually end up looking pretty good in the end. And so I need to staple this and all the other pieces before I put this together. Alright, I'm in the process of stapling the side piece together. You can see this is the piece that goes on the wall. I've got it stapled all the way around. This one gets stapled completely. And this is the side piece and the part that comes out into the front. You start by stapling on the edge here. This is the edge that this piece will be nailed against, like that. And then the fabric wraps all the way around. You have to staple it in the corner. Now these staples won't show because you're going to be looking at it like this. And then this keeps wrapping all the way around, and then it will come underneath, over the top of this piece. So this piece will come here, this will wrap around, and this will staple on there, like that, after it's all nailed together. I'm nailing together the two pieces on the side here, on the edge. I'm doing the first nailing right here, on the outside edge of this additional piece of wood. I'll be using a finishing nail setter to push them down into the wood so they don't stick out. And then when I wrap this last piece around, in addition to stapling it on, I'll be putting another set of nails along there. Again, that was to give this the heel-toe reaction. And when that's done, then I'll have this one side complete. And just do the same thing with the other side. Alright, I finished putting together the two side pieces here. They're ready to go. And now I'm going to start working on the main decorative piece, crossbeam that goes on top. Now one thing to note here is this is where you have some of this foam that's been glued on. I'm not going to take it off, I'm just going to leave it there because I want it there. And you'll notice also that it's not at the very top. That's where that trim will go, so I'll leave it like that. But if you wanted to, you can always pull this off, pull your foam off and put all new foam in and redo the whole thing so you don't have that trim if you don't want it. The tricky part with this, you notice how I've oversized everything. You want to make sure that if you have any lines like I have here, you want to make sure that it is parallel when you staple it in, otherwise it'll look crooked. And the hard part with this particular design is the corner. What I'll have to be doing is doing a cut, and unfortunately with this particular fabric it tends to fray a lot. So one of the things I'm thinking about doing is I'll put a stay stitch in here to try and hold the fabric together as I curl it around. Otherwise it's the same thing, you just fold it over. This folds over here and gets stapled in, and then the top gets folded over and then tucked in like that. So you wind up with a very nice finish. The last piece of fabric for me to work on stapling is that trim that I have along the top, And I will be putting this back on a little bit differently than it came off. When it came off, the material was completely wrapped around it. But since this is ultra leather, and if you poke a hole through ultra leather, it will show. What I'm going to do is staple the bottom, and then I'm going to wait until I actually attach this to the rest of the valance by nailing through the foam here. Then I will fold this over the top of the valance and staple it in place, and that way I won't have holes in my trim. Got the fabric all stapled on my header board, and I'm ready to start putting the whole valance back together. Of course, these corners, like I say, were a little difficult. I did try this time putting a stay stitch in there to keep it from fraying. That helped, but I always wind up with a little bit of a wrinkle in there, and I have not figured out how to get rid of that, but I'm not a professional, so I do the best I can. And this is the top board that I took off, the one that attaches to the cabinet. I marked it before I took it off. This is towards the wall, and this is the top, because I want to make sure these holes line up correctly. Now, when I was stapling this back together, if you're doing something like this and you decide you want to have a piping here, now the piping comes with a tab, so you could then staple piping on there if you wanted to add a little extra decorative trim, which I don't want. But now I'm ready. I will be putting this on, and I will be nailing with 1-inch brads right through the wood into this board and wrapping it around. So this is the first piece that goes back on. Now I'll be putting the side pieces back in place. Need to make sure that these are at a 90-degree angle, so I'll use an angle here to do that and make sure it's all lined up. I'll be putting nails, 1-inch brads on this side, and then also on the front side to make sure that they go through. And that makes it pretty solid. Now you notice on this one that they had a gap here. I think that's because they wanted to make sure that you had it lined up and they didn't wind up with unevenness here. But when you put this side piece together, make sure you have the bottom edges all lined up correctly right there. Otherwise you'll be a little bit uneven in the end. But I need to nail this together, and it'll be about maybe 6 or 7 nails on the side, and then another group of about 5 on the front. Alright, I got the last piece of trim put on and nailed. Remember, I was talking about how this is ultra leather and you can't nail through it without leaving a hole. So I nailed the trim along the top, and the last thing I need to do is fold the trim over, and then I'm going to staple it there right on the top of the board. And that will basically finish my recover job. And then I have to put it back on the wall. But that's it. And there it is, the finished product, mounted back up on my window. I just need to put the day-night shade back in place, and it's all done.